To my right, you'll see Melissa Hathaway, who's the president of Hathaway Global Strategy, and she has served as a cybersecurity advisor under both the administration of President George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Mr. Chris Painter is currently the president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. He was also a member of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace and the first coordinator for cyber issues for the United States State Department. As we've heard throughout the day from the various speakers at the conference, countries as well as organizations have been accelerating their digital transformation and the reliance on digital technologies to continue to respond to the impacts of the global pandemic, to try to facilitate this hybrid work environment, to continue to automate essential services. And more recently, the European Union has allocated billions of euros for the Recovery and Resilience Facility Plan, which is counting on the single digital market and digital transformation as the key pillars of the European recovery. And many international organizations, from the United Nations to multilateral development banks and other donor foundations, are also investing and banking on digital transformation as key pillars of their development projects and as key enablers of inclusive and sustainable economic growth and social development. But one of the key findings in a recent report that Melissa and I recently published for the World Bank and the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, covering many of these topics, actually found that while many decision makers, senior leaders, donor organizations are thinking about what the technology can bring from a good perspective in terms of improving the digital economy, digital literacy, participation, connecting society to the internet, many are thinking about the downsides and all the negative externalities of the potential misuses of information and communication technologies. So, Melissa, addressing some of the key findings in our report, what do you think are the main reasons why many countries and international development organizations are still struggling to recognize cybersecurity and digital resilience as a core component of their national and economic security priority, or a strategic cross-cutting issue in digital development projects?
Well, thank you, Francesca, and Chris. It's great to see you and be here this afternoon. I think that one of the things that we are looking at from as we're undertaking these digital transformations and we're accelerating our adoption of the technology is we're thinking about the modernization of the infrastructures, the efficiencies that they can bring. And we don't really ever consider the downsides of the dark side of the innovation or how the technology could in fact be manipulated. So at the national level, when we're thinking about cybersecurity and the digital transformation, there really is a disconnect because it's seen as a national security issue or an intelligence issue, law enforcement, and a technical capacity, and not really brought up into that as we're building out infrastructures, we need to actually build in the resilience of these infrastructures. And because we've thought about it as a national security or an intelligence or a law enforcement issue, it doesn't get mainstreamed into what I would say the digital development and digital transformation. You see this in their national security strategies of countries, cybersecurity strategies of countries, and they're not actually brought up into the digital economic strategy of the country. And I think this is going to be very important as we're accelerating the digital transformation at national levels everywhere in the post-pandemic recovery. That we need to ensure that we are investing in the resilience of that recovery and not making our countries more fragile.
If I could maybe just add to that, Melissa.
Yes, please do. I was going to ask you to reflect on that. Yes.
Yeah, which I agree completely with what Melissa said. I think it also reflects, this problem that we see often in this area, which is different communities of interest who have different priorities, different ways of thinking about things, even different lingo for talking about these issues. The cybersecurity people talk about cybersecurity. The digital innovation people talk about things like governance and digital innovation and digital strategies. And often those two categories, for the reasons Melissa said, don't really even talk to each other, don't understand each other. Melissa and I had this experience when we were at the White House back in the beginning of the Obama administration, where we were talking about cyberspace, we were talking about the broader concepts, and some of the folks, and we were housed in the National Security Council, but some of the folks in the Economic Security Council didn't, thought about us more of a drag on them rather than something that could empower them. And I think one of the key efforts, and this also carries through the development community too, the development community doesn't think about cyber as a foundational element for all we need to do. They think of it more as this law enforcement, national security issue where they need to be intertwined. Those communities need to be intertwined. We made some progress in doing that since Melissa and I were there back in 2009, but I think there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, and let me build on that.
Yeah, please do.
Let me build on that because I think that there's, even when you reflect on what's going on now in the United States in the Build Back Better and the infrastructure bill, where the current President Biden and team are trying to put another $1 trillion into infrastructure modernization of the United States. There's been no money set aside for resilience. There's no discussion about security. And even with the small pittance that was given to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, under the Department of Homeland Security for their cybersecurity mission, there's a complete disconnect on the Build Back Better and ensure that it's digitally resilient and the like. And so that's our Recovery Act for the pandemic, post-pandemic infrastructure modernization. And even in the United States, there's still a disconnect of not building in the resilience and security that's needed for that $1 trillion to actually achieve what we want to have, building it back better.
Thank you. And Chris, if I can follow up on that with you, actually, you also recently published a report on prioritizing capacity building as a foundation of cybersecurity and stability. And the title of today's Fireside chat is that the time is now to prioritize cybersecurity, digital resilience. And you highlighted how the pandemic specifically has highlighted this increasing dependence of both developed and developing countries on information and communication technologies, but also has it highlighted the vulnerability of all these systems to interference by malicious actors. So how can countries continue to invest on their digital transition, to relaunch their economies, to boost their recovery, while also prioritizing cybersecurity and stability in cyberspace?
Well, first, let me say what I should have said the first time, which is it's great to be with both of you and really welcome this opportunity to speak to everyone at the conference, very important conference that we participated in for many years. And also to thank the two of you for the report, the very thorough and I think detailed, data-driven report that you issued, which I think is enormously helpful and I recommend people read. So my piece was not nearly as thorough or as detailed as yours. However, I do think that there is this opportunity we have now where the pandemic, for all the terrible things it's caused, and there's been many, many of those, there's been a little bit of a silver lining, and it's illustrated to governments and to sectors who before would dismiss this idea of cybersecurity or resilience, how important it is. Because if we are so dependent on these technologies to do everything in our everyday lives, if it becomes the avenue for us to recover, then that heightens the political priority. I mean, one challenge I think over the years I've seen with cybersecurity is it is the province of, the security people, and it seldom gets that high level political priority. It's changed recently with ransomware and some other things that have happened, but seldom has it gotten that same political priority by countries that economic growth, innovation, et cetera, has. And as Melissa said too, I think it's a failure of vision to understand that cybersecurity is the road on which we have all this traffic. It's the foundation for all the good things we're trying to do and to also fight all the bad things. So I do think there's an opportunity that's created here. It requires follow through, though. It requires the agencies, and they're often different ministers, different agencies, and different governments who traditionally don't talk that much together, to see that this is an all of government enterprise. That is, and not just government, but industry and other stakeholders too. And as you put this plan together, that it can all risk falling apart if you don't have good, strong cybersecurity and resiliency, because we've seen again and again those vulnerabilities being exploited by nation states, by transnational criminal groups, by lone gunman hackers. we can't afford to have our digital future, as important as that is, just fall apart if there's no trust in that environment, if that environment can be easily taken down, or if we don't have trust in the data that we have. So I think there's an opportunity for all of us, and that's why it's so good to be on this panel and welcome your report, to make that case strongly, not just among us, not just among the cyber cognoscente, but to the larger community that deals with larger development issues, with larger economic issues. And that's going to be a key, I think, evangelistic effort for all of us going forward.
Thank you. And Melissa, if I can ask you to reflect on that with some practical recommendation as countries, governments around the world continue to pursue this digital strategy or the recovery plans with a strong digital component. How can they de-risk this digital development project, their digital strategies, if ultimately the goal is to ensure that their national strategies, their economic policy, their recovery plans are sustainable, are secure, and are resilient?
Yeah, I think that's it's very important as we start to de-risk, is we really need to think about the sustainability of these infrastructures and these investments over time. And one of the things that we're not building into the budgets of these projects, whether it's an energy grid or a national identity program, or building a new hospital or a school, is we're not thinking about first the technology, the hardware and software. We maybe make a one-time investment and are not thinking about the capital or the capital refresh of these commodities that need to be replaced every 5 to 7 years, or maybe if you're lucky, 10 years. And so we need to be thinking about the technology refresh of the things that we're deploying right now, so it's sustainable. We need to think about the personnel and the training that's going to be required in order to operate these technologies and ensure that they are secure and resilient. And again, we're not thinking about the operational costs associated with it and sustainability of the personnel and the like, and the human resources required. So sometimes these investments, we make that one-time investment, and you could even argue that that's happening right now in so many countries, whether it's individually our countries in our digital transformation, or it's the multilateral donation, the banks that are investing, is they're thinking about it as one project over however long it takes to get up and running. And then there's not thinking about the longer term budget that's going to require to sustain it. And that has to be built into at the overarching national level budget, with, again, thinking about the technology refresh, the operational capacity to continue to run it securely and resilient, safe, trusted environment, and those unique aspects. So when you think about the de-risking, you have to think about what is the lifetime span of this infrastructure, this project. Is it 50 years? Is it 100 years? Is it 10 years? And then build in the funds associated with it, the training associated with it, awareness associated with it, in order for it to be something that we can, again, use and trust securely, safely, and it be resilient to when somebody wants to cause harm. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that totally. I say that there's too much of an attitude that even when cybersecurity gets attention, that it's a set and forget kind of thing, and it's not. It requires focus. It requires long-term focus. As Melissa said, I think that's absolutely important. I'm a bit heartened. I mean, I do think that there's a lot more we need to do in this area, but I have seen some institutions like the World Bank, for instance, now look at not just the cybersecurity strand as a separate silo, but look at other projects they're funding, infrastructure projects, water projects, food projects, and trying to build cybersecurity, or at least it being thought about from the beginning of those projects. And that's great. That's exactly where we need to go. I'm heartened by, for instance, our USAID and Britain's development agency. Melissa will easily remember when we tried to get USAID really much more involved in this back, 10 years ago now, or 12 years ago, or I guess longer than that, involved. And the reaction was, we have lots of other priorities and cyber doesn't really fit. Whereas now they are really taking up that cause and they're trying to weave it into their other development agenda. And that's that's where we need to go, because it's not just a one-off. It's not just a small amount of funding or a small part of a grant. It's that longer-term effort, and it needs to be combined and mainstreamed, and not set as a separate thing.
And
Right.
Chris,
In
that's a
fact,
perfect segue to go ahead, Melissa. Sorry.
I was just like, USAID just published their cyber primer, so that the people in the field, and as people are developing new projects, that they start to think about security, resilience, safety, privacy, and embed those into their projects. European Bank of Reconstruction and Development has also just put through a digital resilience and thinking through how do you build safety, security, resilience, privacy into their projects. So the multilateral donators are now starting to incorporate it into their portfolios. Just like Chris said about the World Bank, there are others, but it's still at the very beginning of maturity of traditional development, and understanding that traditional development is all underpinned with digital at this point, and that has to be de-risked.
Right. And Chris, I was going back to your report where, again, you note that there has certainly been a growing demand for assistance, especially with cybersecurity capacity building activities in recent years. And I think there is a general recognition that achieving better cybersecurity, developing cyber capacity are a growing priority for all countries, developed and developing nation. But you also noted that despite this growing need for cyber capacity building, this broad range of activities are still under prioritized and underfunded, especially when you compare them with traditional development areas from physical infrastructure, water, health. So why should countries and development institutions place more focus, more resources, and more attention to this vital area of cyber capacity building?
So I think in part the reason for that, we talked about it, is that it hasn't reached the right decision makers. It hasn't become a political priority at the very high levels when they're thinking about how they do this. In development agencies, it's the same thing. It hasn't been embraced as a core development priority. And I think we've talked about this, but it bears repeating that if you think about all the things we're trying to achieve in a digital world, in a digital developed world, everything is dependent on technology. Everything is dependent increasingly on computers and computer networks, and the security of those networks and the resiliency of those networks. When you can take down an electrical power grid for a country, which has dependencies, almost everything else is dependent on your electrical power grid. When you can, affect the food supply or the transportation network or the financial network, which is all increasingly dependent on these networks, that's a pretty good business case, I would say, for people. Even, you don't have to be a coder to understand the importance of cyber. I mean, I think there's this sense that cyber is this technical issue and only technical people can grasp it. And that's why often it's been ignored or not paid attention to at the right level, at senior policy levels. And it really is an enabler. It is and a disabler if you don't treat it well, if you don't actually work on it. And so as we revel in all these great things where we can control things remotely, and we can have much more convenience, and we can have much more efficient use of these resources, we absolutely need to invest in this. And I think, there's reasons why it's been underfunded and under prioritized. I think there's some sense that other people will fund it. Sometimes countries were like, oh, the security people, they'll take care of that, or the companies will take care of it. That's just not true. It needs help. And what we also find is that even when the funding is there and the resources there, there's often duplication and repetition, and it doesn't have the strategic approach we need. As Melissa said, they'll not look into the next year, but the next 10 years and make sure you're making substantive progress. So that's something my organization, the GFC, is specifically built to try to address, to try to get better coordination around this. But that's a big challenge that we need to meet going forward.
Thank you. And that's, again, perfect segue to the cooperation. Melissa, if you can actually address why we also need better coordination and cooperation among all of these implementers and funders and recipient countries and other stakeholders that are involved in many of these activities at the international level.
Yeah, so the United Nations has estimated that there's a $1 trillion gap in this infrastructure investments. And what's interesting is that you have investments happening at the national level, and then you have investments happening from the donor community to the national level. And And so there's a disconnect on like multiple levels. First of all, the country has to do a self-assessment of like, where is it going from its digital economy? What makes it strong? And how is it generating its GDP? What are its primary exports? What are its primary imports? What are the key industries? And starting to do that evaluation of where are the investments going to give you the largest value creation or return on investment. The donor communities are coming in and saying, there are darling countries that so many donor communities are coming in to support. And then there are countries that are not getting any support, but still need it. And so if the donor community could, one, start to work with either the UN or the national level and start to understand who else is investing and where, and so that we could actually have a handoff or have broader investments in the country, and start to look more broadly into other countries, to the countries that are not getting the funding. So we look at this as kind of in our report. We talked about this as we've got to deconflict the donor community or get them to talk to each other, which is not naturally happening. And then the second is we need to network the networks. So we need to actually introduce the cybersecurity community, who are much broader than just technical, to the donor community, so that we can get the power of both communities working in these countries. And so that you could have, a multi-billion-dollar energy grid going in that's being informed and de-risked through the cybersecurity and thinking about resilience. Or when you're building a national identity program, understanding that you have to encrypt the data and you have to put these segmentation, et cetera, so that a criminal can't break into the national identity database, which just recently happened in Nigeria, and take everybody's national identity and then start to conduct criminal activity. I mean, we need to be thinking about this strategically. And so that requires networking the network, the power of both of those communities working together, and then deconflicting or optimizing the investments coming from the donor community so that there could be more done with probably less. And that's, the duplication of effort and or the handoff, or one donor bank comes in to do one part and then they hand it off to the continuity to the next donor bank to do the next part, et cetera. And that would go a long way to actually helping digital development become sustainable development.
Right.
Yeah,
and Chris, you mentioned the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. So I would love for you to expand a little bit more on how a specific organization is working to elevate cyber capacity building at the international level.
Sure. And first, I think we need to make the pie larger. We need to have more resources there. And that's a challenge for all the reasons we talked about. And even when you go outside of governments, the philanthropy field has not been very strong in this area. There's a couple of standouts like, the Hewlett Foundation and Gates and some others, but it hasn't caught on. So we need to make that pie larger. Second, we need to actually tailor, and this is something the GFC is trying to do. The GFC is a multi-stakeholder institution that brings together about 150 governments, civil society players, private industry, and academia. And the point is to do exactly that. We're trying to deconflict. We're trying to make people aware of what's out there. There's something that's called the Civil Portal, which puts all these best practices, which everyone can look at. There's a matchmaker function, which is critically important. So a country says, I need help, and we can match them with, as Melissa said, a consortium of donors, of implementers, a plan to make sure these things go forward over time and that there's actual progress made. It's not just a one-off and you leave. So that's part of it. A global research agenda to make sure we're looking at gaps, mapping what's out there and looking at gaps and trying to make the most of the resources that are out there while at the same time trying to grow those resources. So that's really what the institution is about. It's interesting. We have focused in the last year on what we call a demand-driven approach. And the reason for that is, too often the donor community and the implementation community sometimes just tries to staple something on and say, well, we think a government needs this, we're going to give it to them. And they may not. I remember doing a seminar in the Pacific Islands, and one country came to me and said, we don't need the 10th edition of how to build a CERT, a Computer Emergency Response Team 101. We get that already. We don't have enough time to do that. Give us other things that we need. And so listening to that community, I think, is going to be critically important going forward. And then on the issue of raising the political awareness of this, we, the GFC, in partnership with the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and the Cyber Peace Institute, and a number of governments and others, plan to have a big meeting, a big conference in the World Bank headquarters in Washington at the end of this year, where we try to have that political attention. We try to bring those different stakeholder communities together, the development community, the traditional development community, and the cyber community, and others. Tall order to do that, but we need to start figuring out ways to do that. So that's something we're trying to do too. So the organization is now, 7 years old. The GFC, it keeps growing. It provides, I think, a real critical element. It's really the only organization that does. But we need to continue to do what we're doing, and particularly, as your report indicated, reaching out to these other communities and connecting these networks and networks.
Thank you. And since we only have 3 or 4 minutes left, I would be remiss if I didn't ask specifically about the European Union. Since we have so many decision maker and policy maker today listening in, as you both know, the EU approved its largest stimulus package ever financed on the continent, again, to address the impact of the pandemic and to boost recovery. And this plan specifically asks countries to allocate at least 20% of the funds that will be made available to support digital transformation. So Melissa, how would you recommend the EU governments that are still in the process of fine-tuning and implementing their respective national recovery and resiliency plans, what should they do in addition or think about in order to foster this sustainable and resilient recovery and in developing more digital economies and digital societies?
Well, I think that the recovery resilience facility is really important. And as you know, and as everybody knows, it has targets for meeting the climate goals and fielding green and alternative energy initiatives, as well as the digital. And right now, digital has already exceeded, at least in the programs and plans, the target was 20%. It's already at 26% with the portfolio that's funded. So when I look at that and I map it to the Europe's digital transformation and shaping Europe's digital future, right? Which Europe's digital decade is over the 5-year roadmap that's been published. These have to be aligned. So the digital projects need to start to look at the digital compass, and which gives the broadband targets for the countries that have not gotten the high speed, low cost delivery of broadband and internet. It needs to be mapped to the cybersecurity strategy with the NIS2 directive, the Network and Information Security 2, which is expanding the list of covered entities, and the certification framework for products, services, and processes of how we're going to make sure that the products that we buy, the services we get, and the processes that are instantiated in these critical infrastructures are secure and resilient, and the data is safe and protected and private. And I think it also needs to map. We should be thinking about how it maps to the EU Artificial Intelligence Act and ensuring that the technology is deployed safely. And then also we need to be thinking about the financial stability and resilience of these and where the investments are coming from abroad, because this has been a key area that we're worried about, from, whether it's the Belt and Road and China's investments of buying key industries, or Russia's over basically control of the energy market. And we need to, so I think that as countries are building the resiliency facility and taking those and making those targets, they need to think broadly about the risk and ensure that, that they're buying down or they're de-risking these investments and thinking about the long term, 5 to 10 years out, not just a one and done or one project among these other things.
Thank you. And with a little few seconds left, Chris, I don't know if you have a message before we thank our audience and wish them a nice evening.
I endorsed what Melissa said, and would just say that as countries do this, it goes back to something we said earlier, getting those different communities to talk to each other as they're building these strategies. So not just the economic, but the security people talking to each other within the country. But there's also a role for what they're doing outside their country, because these vulnerabilities, they're international, the cooperation is international. So some of these resources should be allocated to helping other countries as well. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. I just want to encourage everybody. Go ahead.
So I agree with these are not individual things. Everybody has a shared infrastructure. Energy is shared, telecommunications is shared. And so one country could do one thing and it could actually destabilize another country. So we need to be thinking about this more holistically.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Chris. And we wish you all to enjoy the rest of the conference tonight. Thank you for joining us.